Oh, oh. Okay. I asked her to turn it on, and she did. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started as we trickle in, as is our tradition, so to speak. I think we're more trickled in today than we were last week, being Easter and people running a little more behind and so on and so forth. Okay, last week as we began to look into the 20th century, basically what was going on, we were going to see that the apocalyptic outlook that many in the churches of Christ held was going to come under great challenge. And we looked at some of our terminology. And remember, we looked at millennialism, that idea of the 1,000-year reign. We refreshed ourselves with post-millennialism. Carl, you're one up too far.
Watch me in case that one girl.
We have to keep our traditional seats. So that's funny. And so post-millennialism, again, was the idea that things were going to improve and get better so that Christ would come. And so that would bring on the reign. And then premillennialism was the idea that Christ had to come to bring on the premillennial reign. And so we didn't. And that's the view that those scriptures are historic and not this. And so, however, that was not in the context of what we're looking at, or as importance, if you will, in particular. And so, yes, generally. Now, okay, Joe is pointing out that the Church of Christ. Joe is pointing out, well, what is amillennialism? In other words, yeah, that historic understanding of Revelation, Daniel, and so on and so forth. Do what? Now, however, well, let me turn this off, and that's just fellowship. No. Well, you know why? Because that position of amillennialism was going to come on strongly because of all this. Well, that Revelation 20 is the source of those interpretations, and remember the premillennial, as we would understand it now, kind of came about in the early 19th century in England by a guy named Darby, or kind of started promoting it. But post-millennial, this view of things are improving, things are getting better, and then Christ would come at the end of that great time of improvement. So we need to keep improving to hasten Christ's coming, is the post-millennial view. And Campbell and others were very dominant in that. Well, not everybody held that. Well, there was that would be the premillennial position would question that. What can we do to bring on these things? God's gonna, and so we're see this, and not everybody held to the same thing, and so we're trying to understand that, because in the early 20th century, for 25, 30 years, well, correct, you weren't around when this was starting, and that's why we're covering that, Joe. Joe, how much caffeine did you have this morning? Okay. Maybe that's the problem. No. And so, and so we see that because of Stone, it wasn't Campbell, and in Tennessee, this idea of this apocalypticism that we are here to serve the kingdom of God, not the kingdoms of the world. And so this idea of not being involved, not voting, and so on, we touched on some of that, was very strong and very prevalent. And so we also looked at Harding. And Harding was one who this was strongly and deeply embedded in him. And that was the idea that, we live, and let's not get involved in the world. And so he didn't have much earthly goods. He kind of went day to day. He wouldn't take a salary. He wouldn't do this. He wouldn't do that, because he felt in doing so that would be putting his trust in things other than God's providence. And so we also saw that when the idea of missionary societies and coming together, he was opposed to that, because he says that's us trying to control instead of letting God do it in his way of thinking. And so we see that. And so as we were getting toward the end last week, we saw that this also got into what became a controversy is should you have located preachers? And so in Tennessee, there wasn't a whole lot of that. And so some, as often when we get something that kind of gets stuck in us, that bothers us, we often apply that to the reason for other things going wrong when it may not be at all. And so there was this conflict. And so Harding had these strong ideas that, there shouldn't be a located preacher. You shouldn't pay the preacher a salary, and so on and so forth. Love offerings, things like that. And so they should go around. And so that was what they called a system of what we would kind of later call mutual edification, that was very strong in some segments of ours. And so they felt that. Well, there was going to be those others who didn't think that. And we saw a brother named White, who was in Texas, that was challenging that. And so we're kind of looking at this debate through those eyes. And so it's precisely this context that one finds this early major shift among churches of Christ toward what we would call our institutional or denominational status, this establishing of this way. In 1910, a full-blown written debate, as we said, erupted between Harding and this brother L.S. White, who was in Texas. And they had little doubt that both the larger shift and the debate were, at least in some degree, regionally and economically inspired. In other words, if you were for located preachers, that you saw that there's good reason for that, and that may be partly because you had the economic means to bring that about, and those that didn't necessarily hold to that view. And so there's other factors often that go into the theological understandings that we develop to some degree. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. In other words, none of this. No.
They also support the training of the young men in the congregations
Yeah.
to learn and know the techniques of preaching and teaching.
Uh-huh.
And therefore, they're really in depth with that. In western Missouri, you'll find a lot of that.
Yes, and it tended to be smaller and tend to be more rural-oriented overall, or located, I should say, and things like that. And you know what? There are positives, certainly, to that. You know, just like there's also positives for the other. And often we cloak those things in terms of this is all right or this isn't, or vice versa. And, you know, maybe that's not necessarily the case. Now, in some places, the mutual edification, if you will, the thinking on that is kind of making a comeback at times. And some of that's out of necessity because there aren't near as many people going into the preaching and the training and the finding as we found here, and we're not unique in that at all. And so there's been some that at one time were putting that down are looking at it again. And so, you know, there's some lessons there about, you know, maybe not always getting so worked up about certain positions and, you know, what goes around comes around and things like that. So just kind of a little side note. And so this shift to the pastor system occurred chiefly among those that could afford it, the North and apparently Texas. I don't know if the oil wells were going strong yet, but nonetheless, and west of Nashville and especially Texas. So you had these regions. Now, the Nashville churches, rooted in the apocalyptic thinking of Harding and Lipscomb, remained firmly committed to this older system of itinerant preaching and mutual edification. Harding reported that the Nashville school had sent perhaps 125 preachers into the field, and fewer than a dozen of these, he thought, favored the pastor system. So he says, those that think like that aren't around here. And you know how we often look at things. As we understand what makes sense to us, why doesn't it make sense to everybody else? And assume it should be that way. Fewer than a dozen of these, he said, favored the system. Further, not a single teacher at the Nashville Bible School supported this innovation. Well, nobody here supports that kind of thinking. And his own congregation, which met in the school's chapel, was led in its meetings by elders who encourage every brother who will to take part in speaking, prayer, and song. In fact, he reported that Nashville has a greater number of congregations that conducted their meetings without the pastor than any other city in America, as far as I can learn. So his view of things there, and that was, I'm sure that was so. And so we see this very different view. Now, L.S. White found the Nashville practice a scandal and an offense. Shocking. He charged that it retarded not only the development of a strong core of preachers in the United States, but also the development of missions abroad. In other words, in his view, those that are trained and studied and educated more could probably do a better job than those that have just kind of learned on their own, is the thinking. And you know what? We can understand that. That's not nuts. However, that has its issues too, as some would look at it. You know, and we'll look at that as we go along. He argued that Harding's views were doing untold harm, and White's chief concern was the growth and the institutionalization of the churches of Christ, objectives he felt could hardly be realized if churches remained tied to Harding's apocalypticism. In other words, that's just kind of a basic way of going about it, and how can you really become big and firm and things like that? At the heart of this debate was a dispute not simply over the pastor system or even institutionalization, but over two radically differing worldviews, which to a significant degree reflected the circumstances in which Harding and White lived. In Harding, one finds a poor man governed almost entirely by the sectarian apocalyptic perspective that he long characterized the churches of Christ there in Tennessee. And we've talked in depth about that. In White, one finds a man governed by the hard-nosed pragmatism and a rigorous doctrine of self-reliance, the sort of the attributes that characterize people living on the rough-and-tumble Texas frontier. And so we see, again, our life experiences affecting how we view and interpret and develop theology. And so for him, you know, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You know, I've heard the expression before, you got to put feet to those prayers. You know, and well, but that's a little bit of this understanding, and it's not nuts or crazy or so out there. But yes, Joe. Harding. Yeah. Or they didn't have means to pay him a regular salary. Hmm. No, sure. Well, sure, there's probably what we would call a vocational, or is that bivocational? I get it mixed up. You know, where you're working your job and you're preaching, and there's quite a bit of that today.
That's the situation coming out of schools down there today. Harding University, last year their graduation, I think, graduated 5 guys that were going to go into the preaching. Several more that were going to go into youth ministry, but a lot more that were going to do computer science or something
Yeah,
and preach on the side.
yeah. And some of that perspective, that way of looking, is for some being encouraged. And so it isn't just, you know, I want to do that. And parts of the reason for that is, hey, you go into a place and you're preaching, that congregation isn't, they're getting all in a huff about what you're saying about this or that, and then they fire you, and then you're out on the street. And so these kind of ways and practices have contributed some, not all, but some to those choices. People don't want to be controlled by the paycheck, if you will, and that's just the reality. That's not all of it, but that figures into some of it. So it's a lot of different things. It's usually not one thing, and so yeah, so it's a variety of things. But I think then it was a theological position that was informed by their economic status, things like that. And so it wasn't as strong because that wasn't preached there. Then you get down to Texas and they go, hey, wait a minute. If we had the guy doing that, then they'll know more and we can, you know, so on and so forth. And so anyhow, just realizing these other factors that fit in. Harding professed that for 36 years I have endeavored to follow the directions of Jesus literally. I have avoided the accumulation of property. There have been few, if any, times in these 36 years that I've had enough money to bury me. If I died, I've owned 2 horses, and at different times, and a buggy. I've owned 2 cows, and at different times, and a calf. I doubt if there had been any time in these 36 years when all of my possessions would have brought me as much as $500 if they'd been sold at public auction. And so he's sharing his experiences. And he has chosen to do this, just like Barton Stone did in a lot of ways, is viewing that this is a way to live that way. And so it was very sincere and very real. You know, it's not something that should be belittled. Now, how many of us would choose that today? I'd probably say none of us. Well, they're way different, sure. Even from 100 years ago. And that's not necessarily that's just a little thing. Yes, and it will, creates the wrong word, but people's theology is based upon their experiences. But now the thing is this person's experiences might not be that person's experiences, and so there's a lot more diversity out there in thought, and there's points to be made, from the different perspectives. But anyhow. Mm-hmm. Correct, and we all say that, but our experiences still inform how we look at things. And so I'm talking an awareness, I'm not talking this is right or this is wrong. It's just an awareness that our biblical understanding isn't necessarily as pure as we like to think it is. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying it's just those factors. In Harding's view, this poverty was a virtue. And Benjamin Franklin was one that we talked about, held that, and many did. And should get by on as little as possible and give the surplus to the poor. And so some of that came behind, you don't pray your preacher much so you can keep him honest, so to speak. And nonetheless. But White considered Harding's arguments to be out. I'm sorry? I think he had a place to live, but he didn't own a house. Probably rented. Maybe someone donated to him. I don't know Harding's history enough specifically to be able to answer that. So, who knows? Yeah, well, you're right. And, we're kind of struggling with this because we don't think this way or talk at all because of the situation we're in. And we think, having a little something's better than not having something because of the stress and the struggle that those things bring on, and so just interesting to contemplate. I don't think so, but I don't know. I haven't looked deep enough in the Harding, but but it wasn't like it was hundreds of thousands of dollars. And someone that had been dedicated to doing what he was doing so much for so long. Basically, he hadn't accumulated much, and he didn't have the liquid. He had the physical things. He was what do they say? Land rich and cash poor, so to speak. It was a little bit of that. So, but White considered Harding's arguments to be out of touch with reality, and at least out of touch with the reality of the early 20th century culture in Texas. When Harding suggested that it was wrong to lay up treasures on earth where moth and rust corrupt, what are you doing hanging on to this? White reported, I insist that nothing will rust and corrupt as long as it's being used. And when we have money and other property, as long as we use the glory of God, it will never rust and corrupt. And so we see this economic battle, if you will, thinking theologically addressed going on. Well, sure. It seems silly to us on this side of all that and where we're at financially, economically, middle class that we are, things like that. But to them, it was very real, very heartfelt, very important and significant. And so, we've often told ourselves things are this way, they've always been this way, this is how they should always be, and I'm not sure that narrative is correct, within, the church, et cetera, et cetera. And meaning there's always been these changes in these periods. We might not be aware of them, so we think it wasn't so. But nonetheless, he's always been there. Further, White totally rejected the notion that God might supernaturally provide apart from human arrangements and foresight. Creation began in a miracle but ended in natural order. In that natural order, he insisted there was only one way to secure the necessities of life: hard work. In other words, if you didn't do it, it wasn't going to happen. If you didn't dig your well, you weren't going to have water. If you didn't, this or that and so on. Well, it's influencing how he looks at things. And there's some sense to it. It's not that it's nutty. But nonetheless, very different from the way Harding would look at it. In addition, White conceded that while Jesus did indeed feed the poor through miracles, after the church was established, the disciples were taught to relieve people by giving of their means. And while Jesus taught his disciples to pray for their daily bread after the church was established, we were taught to do our own business and work with our hands. So again, applying his life on the frontier. When Harding suggested that the reason David never saw the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread, was that he trusted in God, White disagreed, and David's prosperity had nothing to do with trusting in God, he insisted, but everything to do with the great general prosperity that characterized his age. I'm not necessarily advocating any of these things, but making us aware of what's going on. Had David lived in a later period, he would have seen that righteousness forsaken. In other words, if David had lived later. And so, yeah, we see these, and so people try to find ways to justify their positions. Sure. So is that trusting in God if we have insurance? Or is it trusting in an insurance company? Sure. Great question. Great question. We have a great. Some wonder if it's heading that direction. It's just it's challenging. So, but again, we see these theological arguments that are going on, and they're fueled by these perspectives. And so this apocalyptic way of looking at things was going to die out's the wrong word, but was going to be greatly diminished as we move on in the 20th century. In L.S. White, one finds the pragmatic, progressive primitivism of Campbell. Remember, Campbell was all into the things growing, things getting better, being educated, improving. He was very much in that mode and looked at that all as a good thing. Triumphant and complimenting the circumstances in which he lived. Preoccupied as White was with the need to build churches in the growing city of Dallas, he rejected out of hand any possibility of divine providence in his own time and place, and focused his gaze entirely on the pragmatic possibilities of here and now. And so Harding's apocalyptic frame of reference made no sense to him at all. Now, as we look at that, we'd almost think that White's, well, he isn't dealing in faith at all. He's just dealing in himself. And I think some of that element comes across, but that was the mindset. And And that mindset is not as unfamiliar as as we may want to think it is. You know, it's like if I don't do it, it won't happen. And so, you know, again, just that practicality, because out in the frontier, if you didn't do it, it didn't happen. And so that's applied not only to life and existence, that thinking then influences his view on other things. Though Harding fully embraced the apocalyptic sectarian mentality of the Stone Lipscomb tradition, he stood squarely within that exclusive tradition of the Christian Baptist, and we talked a lot about that in the past. We have seen the latter heritage in his confident assertion that our business is to fight everything and everybody that impedes the success of the Master's cause. Now, this is Harding talking. And so what does he mean by that? He's meaning, you know, if I'm seeing missionary society, something adding on, thinking you can do it better than allowing God to do it, and so on and so forth. So his view is we got to fight everything that, to our understanding, is the way it should be. And so that exclusive way of looking at things, you know, brought about a lot of things, a lot of fights, a lot of this, because this must be right. If this is right, that can't be. And so, anyhow. Now, one such man, there was T.B. Larimore. Have we ever heard of that name before? Okay. And Larimore was very interesting. In fact, in your bibliography, Jack Reese's book, at the Blue Hole, an elegy, in that book, some of his storyline is looking at Larimore as part of what he's telling in there. And the reason for that is Larimore was really interesting. He was he was a teenager in the Civil War. And he grew up in Alabama, and he was in the South. And so he was riding scout. He wasn't in the Army, the Southern Army, but he was a scout, and he got captured. And so they kind of scared him to death, and he said that he wouldn't help them or whatever, and they kind of let him go. But anyhow, so Larimore was brought up in this tradition, but he was a little different. He wouldn't take sides. And so because he refused to involve himself in the controversy over instrumental music that was going, he would still go, and remember, the congregations are together, and then that rift is happening over time, finally officially recognized in 1906, but it was happening before that. And so you know, the brothers, the Christians over here are practicing the instrumental music, and those over here don't want anything to do about it. Well, and so they kind of start separating on their own and things like that. Well, Larimore would accept an invitation to speak at the congregation that went instrumental music. Now, he didn't approve of it. He wasn't for that, but he would still do that. He wasn't going to make that be a source of division for him. Well, Harding felt a little bit stronger about it, and in 1900 he refused Larimore the chance to speak at the National Bible School, of which Harding was president at the time. He will never come here to lecture to the boys as long as I'm president of the school, till he takes a stand on the music question, Harding was reported to have said. And so you had those, and he was not the only one that was doing that, but they were not wanting. Some were not wanting to do that. And so for some, you got to take a position, and if you don't hold the right one, you can't. You're not welcome here. And so this was going to be happening also. Larimore's very, very interesting, very fascinating guy. As this incident suggests, Churches of Christ were still very much united in 1900 on this outlook that bequeathed to them, you know, was from that way of looking at things from the Christian Baptist era. But the other source of the sectarian tradition, the apocalyptic outlook of Stone, was slowly unraveling. And so this position that Harding and Lipscomb held, and many others, was going to begin to unravel. And in that regard, Harding and the White affair, battle that was going on, was a prelude to a larger issue that would finally separate Churches of Christ from their apocalyptic underpinnings and place them squarely on the road to denominational understanding. And of course, by that, remember, we're meaning this: at peace with the culture, not separate from everybody, not exclusivistic in that totality. The issue was a great debate over premillennial eschatology, that end times theology and way you look at things. And so again, for us, on this side of it, seems like a time, yeah, we don't agree with that, and what's the big deal? Because that doesn't encompass Churches of Christ now, but back then it did, and it was huge. Now, in 1915, and continuing for more than a third of a century, the emerging mainstream of the Churches of Christ launched a sustained and at times ferocious attack against premillennial thinking of all kinds. The chief object of this attack was, for all those years, was this guy, this brother, who is a mild-mannered German immigrant named Robert H. Bohl, who enrolled in the National Bible School in 1895. And there he studied under Lipscomb, and he studied under Harding. And from there, he learned these views because they held them strongly. And so these perspectives, of course, had come out of that tradition. Stridently anti-modern, Bohl is, questioned whether the boastful splendor of the 20th century and the roar of its civilization represented any serious progress at all. When the United States entered the World War I in 1917, Bohl counseled Christians to refuse to fight. He dismissed the notion that the war was a struggle to make the world safe for democracy, and grounded his pacifist counsel in the Stone-Lipscomb vision that Christians do not belong to the kingdoms of this world. And so was very, very strong in that. This is where he learned it. This thinking made sense to him. Okay, and he was going to be pretty influential and carried it on. There is no question that Bohl learned these lessons from the teachers of the National Bible School, but Harding appears to have been especially influential, and Harding viewed Bohl as a model student and commented, "I wouldn't take $1 million for him." That's pretty significant since he didn't have anything. You know, so that's kind of a powerful statement that he's making. In other words, he thought very highly of him and his spirit and his faith and what he was. Now, substantial evidence suggests that most, if not all, of the leaders that would be in this premillennial wing of the Churches of Christ came directly from the Stone Campbell tradition. Such was the case of Stanford Chambers, and this is Stanford much older than he would have been at the time we're talking about, who in 1908 co-founded and edited a publication called The Christian Word and Work, an important premillennial periodical issued first from New Orleans and later from Louisville, Kentucky, where Bohl would later serve as its editor. And this publication lasted, I'm not sure if it's still in publication, but it lasted a long time, maybe up into the 60s, 70s maybe, but I'm not, I'd have to go look at that. Chambers was born in 1877 and was reared in Indiana. There's those Indiana. Are you familiar with that name? Well, I don't know if churches you grew up in, if would not have, okay. So you mean the indoor porcelain facilities would have been put your soul in jeopardy, huh? Well, Barton Stone migrated, as we said earlier, to Illinois prior to the Civil War to emancipate his slaves. And many of the followers made similar moves to North Illinois and Indiana for the same reason. It is not surprising, therefore, that Chambers, raised in one of the Stonite communities that resulted from that migration, imagined well into his adulthood, and practically everyone in the Churches of Christ shared that premillennial position. In other words, everybody he knew shared that. Well, doesn't everybody? Okay, but because that was who the circle was that he was around. Among the first indications that he received in the Churches of Christ that they opposed this premillennial view, in other words, he thought every Church of Christ thought that way, was in a published debate between L.S. White of Dallas and Charles Taze Russell, who was the founder of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And Chambers had no sympathy with Charles Russell's theory, as it was called, but he also reported, I could not find in my Bible all that Brother White taught. L.S. White, who we were looking at. But to my surprise, his position, meaning White's, met with general approval. In other words, there was this aha, epiphany moment where you realize that what you think so firmly that everybody does, and you realize they don't. And that's what's kind of going on here. Significantly, those in Churches of Christ who oppose the premillennial outlook routinely sought to discredit its proponents by labeling them Russellites, implying that Russell's teachings had convinced them to adopt the position. In the case of Bull and Chambers, this was not the case. Both men adopted the position after having sat at the feet of Lipscomb, Harding, J.N. Armstrong, and others at the National Bible School. So what do we have going on here? We have Russell, who was credited with starting the Jehovah's Witnesses, or the founder of them, however, as one looks back. And apparently, and I haven't studied deeply into him, but apparently a number of things that he understood, Bull would have been in agreement with that. Now, that doesn't mean the totality of what Jehovah, but there's some overlap. We have agreement with Catholicism in numbers of things. We have we can look to all kinds of groups. So does that mean that makes everything invalid of what's being said? And so that's what's happening here, because they held some overlap on some things. They're calling them Russellites, and of course Russell was viewed, well, they don't believe Jesus, Son of God, and so on and so forth, which is significant. I'm not saying that, but they were labeling them in everything they did because of some overlap. And so, yet that isn't where Bull learned it. He learned it from Lipscomb and from Harding. And so there were those that held that. We should note that Bull received his apocalyptic frame of reference at the National Bible School, now Lipscomb. He later expanded this apocalyptic outlook to include the dispensationalism. Remember, we looked at that when we looked at fundamentalism and Dwight Moody and all that. And those, we talked a lot about that. And others whose names we're unfamiliar with due to time and distance. In other words, there was important promoters of this view that have been not lost, but are unfamiliar to us. Thereby developing a perspective that was altogether foreign to the 19th century apocalyptic tradition of the Churches of Christ. So what are we saying here? We're saying this, that what Moody and the fundamentalists were preaching as far as all the details in that apocalypticism was not exactly the same as what Harding and them were. They kind of did this, and that kind of took it and went way over here with it. And yet Bull, because of that kind of connection and studying, he kind of tended to go a little more that way in some things. Not all, but again, nothing's ever all or nothing. Perhaps because of their great faith that Harding and presumably Lipscomb had placed in Bull, the owners of the Gospel Advocate made Bull their front page editor in 1909. So that was the most important editor. For several years, Bull presented his apocalyptic and premillennial notions in the Advocate until in 1915 those ideas began to encounter stiff resistance from his fellow editors. 1915, what was going on then? World War I. And so we're going to see the challenges as to why that was so. The resistance grew so intense that in December, Bull resigned from the staff of the Advocate and moved to become editor of The Word and Work, because that was a publication that was, supportive. I don't know. The ouster of Bull and his staff from the Gospel Advocate marked the beginning of the great war on premillennialism that preoccupied and sapped the energies from preachers and editors in the Churches of Christ well into the 1940s. It seems that the rejection of apocalypticism reflects the final triumph of Alexander Campbell's rational, progressive primitivism over Stone Campbell tradition, or Stone Lipscomb tradition, precisely in the region where that was strongest. And so we see this change that's happening and taking place. Why were Churches of Christ so concerned to destroy the premillennial sediment with the mainspring of the Stone Campbell side of that tradition have been anchored to a profoundly apocalyptic worldview throughout the 19th century? Why would they so completely cut themselves off from the wellspring that nourished them for over 100 years? In other words, why was this happening? You'll have to wait till next week. The cliffhanger. Okay. All right. I did that to you on purpose. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. And we are over time. I guess the bells aren't working today. So thank you very much.